July 12, 1987. That was the night Cedar Creek fell silent, though none of us realized it at first, not until the echo of a knock on the front door carried through our house and changed everything that came after. The day had been stifling, one of those midsummer days when the air itself felt thick, as if the sun had baked the town into stillness. By evening, the cicadas screamed so loudly in the trees that it seemed impossible to hear anything else, yet when the sheriff's boots struck the porch and his knuckles tapped against the frame, the sound cut through all of it, sharp and undeniable. You stood beside your mother in the fading light, her apron still clutched in her hands, her face drawn and pale as Sheriff Calloway shifted uneasily under the weight of the moment. He held his hat against his chest, as if it could shield him from what he was about to say, though his voice, when it came, was flat and rehearsed, like lines spoken too many times in front of a mirror. "He's gone," the sheriff said, not even pausing long enough for the meaning to settle. "Boys his age get restless. They see the highway stretching out of town, and it pulls them. Happens all the time. He'll turn up." The words fell with the weight of a hammer, and though your mother's voice broke as she pleaded for him to send men into the woods, to search along the riverbank, to at least check the old railway bridge where your brother so often sat when the nights were too long, Calloway's jaw only tightened, and his boots shifted on the porch like he was itching to leave. He muttered something about wasted resources, about how boys leaving wasn't a crime, and then he was done. That was when you saw it, not in the words, but in the way he avoided your eyes, the twitch that flickered across his jawline, the forced calm in his voice. He wasn't there to help you. He was there to close the matter. That was the first silence. That night, you lay awake beneath the whir of a fan that did nothing but push the hot air around, your mind racing while the house creaked and groaned like it too had secrets to carry. Every tick of the kitchen clock echoed through the stillness. Every shift of the floorboards sounded like a footstep. And through it all you could hear your mother, the muffled sobs she tried to hide, the whisper of prayers tumbling over each other, as she clutched her rosary in the dark. You pressed your pillow against your ears, but it couldn't block the memory of the sheriff's voice. "He's gone. He'll turn up." But you knew your brother. He wasn't restless. He wasn't reckless. And he wasn't gone because he wanted to be. You could feel it in your chest like a second heartbeat, insistent and unyielding. He had been taken. The next morning the house felt too small, the walls pressing close as though they too were keeping secrets. Your mother set a plate in front of you, though she hadn't taken any food herself, and you stared at the empty chair at the end of the table that she wouldn't look at, her lips moving silently as her fingers strangled the rosary. By mid-morning, you couldn't stand it any longer. You walked to Main Street, the sun already beating down, heat radiating from the pavement, the storefronts glaring in the harsh light. The church bell rang in the distance, a hollow sound that seemed to mock you. Faces appeared in windows only to vanish the instant you lifted your eyes. When you pushed open the door of the diner, the bell overhead rang and the room froze. Forks hovered midair, cups halted halfway to lips, and for one suspended moment every eye turned toward you. Then, as though on some unspoken cue, they all looked away. You slid into a booth by the window. Mary, who had always greeted you with a warm smile, approached with her coffee pot, but the smile was gone, replaced by something brittle and hollow. She poured without asking, muttered a faint "morning," and hurried away. "Have you heard anything?" you asked, your voice carrying farther than you intended in the hush. Her hand trembled slightly on the pot. "No," she said too quickly. "He'll turn up. They always do." And then she was gone, wiping the counter with unnecessary force, her eyes fixed anywhere but on you. Around you, the murmur of conversation resumed, but softer, broken into fragments you could only half hear. Family, sheriff, trouble. Words that seemed to lean away from you, that bent under the weight of fear. Your coffee cooled in front of you. You never touched it. When you stepped out of the diner, the air felt heavier, as if Cedar Creek itself was pressing down on you, reminding you that you were alone. The sun had begun to sink lower, bleeding red into the horizon, but the heat clung stubbornly, wrapping itself around your skin like a shroud. You walked past the storefronts, and everywhere you turned the town seemed to close itself off, blinds lowered just a little too quickly, doors shut softly but firmly, as though you had brought something with you that no one wanted near their home. At the hardware store, Mr. Daniels was sweeping the steps, his movements steady until your shadow fell across him. When you asked whether he had seen your brother, his hand froze on the broom, his lips pressed tight. Without even lifting his head, he muttered, "Don't know nothing," and turned away, retreating inside and locking the door with a finality that made your chest ache. At the post office, Mrs. Carter dropped her envelopes when she noticed you, the letters scattering like frightened birds across the floor. She bent quickly, her face pale, gathering them with trembling fingers. You tried to help, reaching for one, but she snatched it from your hand without a word, her eyes wide and fearful, as though even your touch might invite danger. She hurried out, leaving you standing in the echo of her retreat. Even the children had changed. Once they would pedal their bicycles past your house, their laughter carrying on the wind. Now, when you passed them on the street, their voices stilled. One boy glanced at you, wide-eyed, before pushing hard against his pedals, the others following him like a flock of birds fleeing a storm. Cedar Creek had chosen its silence, and the silence was as loud as a shout. By evening, when the heat had settled into a thick haze and the neon lights of the bar buzzed to life, you found yourself pushing through its door. The smell hit you first, smoke that had seeped into every board, the sour tang of spilled beer, the weight of decades pressed into the wood and the air. The men inside barely looked up. They sat hunched over tables and along the bar, hats pulled low, shoulders bent as if the very act of sitting straighter might draw unwanted attention. The murmur of their conversations dipped when you entered, not ending, but shifting into a softer register, the kind of whisper meant to sound like nothing at all while still carrying everything you weren't supposed to hear. You slid onto a stool at the counter. The bartender, a man with lines carved deep into his face, didn't bother to ask what you wanted. He poured a shot, amber liquid catching the neon glow, and slid it across the counter. His eyes never met yours, they fixed instead on the far wall, as if he were alone in the room. "I'm looking for my brother," you said, the words falling into the thick air like stones dropped into still water. The glass paused in his hand, the rag clenched tighter. His jaw shifted. "Boys get restless," he muttered. "They leave. That's not what happened." For the first time, his gaze flicked toward you, quick and sharp, and then swept the room. The murmurs had stopped altogether. Men who had been bent over their drinks now stared at the wood grain, at their own hands, at nothing at all. The bartender leaned closer, his voice dropping low, but there was steel in it, a warning honed by years of repetition. "Careful. Some doors don't open easy. And some folks don't like when you knock." You opened your mouth to press him, but he had already turned away, scrubbing the stained glass with a rag that had long since gone gray. His shoulders were tight, his silence louder than his words had been. The whiskey sat untouched in front of you. Your throat burned, but not from drink, from the weight of the silence that pressed in tighter with every passing second. The bar had nothing for you but walls and shadows, and you realized, with a cold certainty, that the silence of Cedar Creek was not born of ignorance. It was born of fear. You left the bar as the last streaks of daylight drained from the sky, the town sinking into the blue of night. The cicadas had begun their endless chorus again, rising and falling like waves against the silence. You walked, your steps carrying you without thought, until the looming outline of the railway bridge rose before you. The bridge had always been a place of refuge. You remembered nights spent there with your brother, the two of you perched on the beams, legs dangling over the tracks, the distant rumble of trains shaking the wood beneath you. He would flick his lighter open and shut, the metallic click steady in the darkness, and talk about the places he wanted to go, the towns where no one knew your name, the cities that pulsed with light and movement. "One day," he used to say, his voice stubborn, certain, "we'll get out. You'll see." Now the bridge stretched out empty, its boards creaking beneath your steps. The night air smelled of oil and old wood, of rust and damp stone. You moved slowly, each footfall echoing in the stillness, the cicadas falling silent as if the world itself was listening. At first, you thought it was just the moonlight catching on a nail. But then the glint returned, sharp and silver against the gravel near the center of the bridge. You crouched, your breath catching, and brushed away the dirt. A lighter. Scratched, dented, the once polished surface dulled by time and use. But unmistakable. You turned it over in your hand, and your chest tightened. The initials were faint but clear, carved into the side by your father's hand, a gift given on your brother's 16th birthday. You could see him in your memory, flicking it open and shut when he was nervous, tracing the engraving with his thumb until the letters gleamed. He had never been without it. And now it lay here, half buried, discarded on the bridge where he once dreamed of escape. It wasn't lost. It was left. Your fingers curled around the metal, the weight of it pulling at your hand as though it carried not just fire, but truth. This was proof. Your brother hadn't walked away from Cedar Creek. He had been taken. And someone wanted you to believe otherwise. The night around you seemed to close in, heavy and watchful, and for the first time you felt it, not just silence, but danger, sharp and deliberate, wrapping itself around the town like a noose. The morning after you found the lighter, Cedar Creek felt sharper, as though the town itself had grown teeth overnight. The sky was a flat, heavy blue, the sun already high, yet everything seemed dim, drained of color, like someone had lowered a veil over the streets. You walked along Main Street, past storefronts you had known your whole life, and for the first time they looked unfamiliar, as if the paint on the signs and the bricks in the walls had been rearranged into something hostile. At the diner, the silence was no longer subtle. Mary didn't even try to smile when she saw you. She placed a plate in front of you, burned toast, runny eggs, food she knew you wouldn't eat, and walked away without meeting your eyes. The scrape of her shoes on the linoleum was the only sound, until you noticed two men at the counter, their heads bowed close together. "Family's not gonna like this," one whispered. "They'll handle it," the other replied, voice low and certain. "Sheriff's got it covered. They always do." The word lodged in your chest like a thorn. Family. In Cedar Creek, there was only one family anyone meant when they said it like that. The Johnsons. Everyone knew who they were, though few dared speak their name aloud. The Johnsons weren't just another landowning clan. They were the spine of Cedar Creek, the ones who held its bones together and threatened to break them whenever someone stood too tall. They owned the mill, the grain silos, the freight contracts that kept food moving out and money moving in. They owned half the land outside town, and most of the stores within it. Mortgages, loans, debts, all of them tied back, one way or another, to the Johnsons. And they owned people, too, though not with paper or ink. They owned them with fear. Stories clung to the Johnsons like smoke. A farmhand who complained about his pay was found bloodied in a ditch, the sheriff calling it an accident. A bartender who refused them credit had his windows shattered 3 nights in a row until he shut down for good. A young man who crossed them in a fight simply vanished, and within a week his family packed up and left town without a word. No one ever questioned these things out loud. No one dared. The silence itself was proof of who pulled the strings. And now your brother had pulled too hard. That evening you found Mark sitting behind the gas station, hunched against the wall with a cigarette smoldering between his fingers. His face was pale, his eyes shadowed, and when he saw you his whole body stiffened, as though you were a ghost. "You know something," you said, keeping your voice low, steady. He shook his head too quickly, dragging hard on the cigarette. "I told you before. I don't." "You were with him, Mark." His hand trembled slightly as he flicked ash onto the dirt. "He shouldn't have gone there," he muttered, almost too softly to hear. Your heart jumped. "Gone where?" He froze, and you could see the war in his eyes, the part of him that wanted to speak and the part that wanted to survive. Finally, he glanced across the street, where a Johnson truck sat idling, its windows black, its engine humming low. His voice dropped to a whisper. "You don't get it. Nobody wins against them. Nobody." He crushed the cigarette under his heel and walked away, shoulders hunched, leaving you in the shadow of the truck. The words clung to you like smoke. He shouldn't have gone there. That night you sat at the kitchen table with the lighter in your hand, turning it over and over. Your mother sat across from you, rosary tangled in her fingers, her lips moving in prayers that sounded more like bargaining than faith. He didn't leave. You said, your voice firmer than you expected. I found this. He wouldn't have dropped it. Her hands froze on the beads, her eyes dark and hollow. For a moment she said nothing. Then, in a voice so faint it was almost a breath, she whispered, I told him not to cross them. I told him. The rosary slipped from her hands, beads scattering across the table like tiny bones. Them? You pressed, leaning forward. Her face twisted, fear and fury blending into something raw. Drop it. Do you hear me? Drop it, before they bury you too. She rose so suddenly her chair toppled behind her, and she left the room without looking back. It wasn't just fear speaking. It was memory. Your mother knew more than she would ever say aloud. And that terrified you more than anything else. The house felt smaller that evening, as though its walls had leaned inward while you were gone, shrinking the rooms and tightening the air. Your mother had locked herself in her bedroom, her muffled prayers carrying through the wood of the door like the rhythm of some secret language meant for no one's ears but God's. You stayed in the kitchen for a time, the lighter resting on the table in front of you, its scratched silver surface catching the light every time you turned it over, as though the metal itself still carried the echo of your brother's hand. You tried to eat, but the food turned to dust in your mouth. Every creak of the floorboards overhead made you glance up. Every groan of the pipes made your heart stumble. Silence had once been familiar in Cedar Creek, the comfortable quiet of a town too small to be loud, but now it was something else entirely, a silence that was watchful, pressing, like 1,000 unspoken things humming just beneath the surface. When you couldn't stand the closeness of the house anymore, you stepped outside. The sun had fully set, the horizon still faintly red but giving way to deep blue shadows. The air smelled of warm earth and cut grass, heavy with the song of cicadas that filled every pocket of darkness. You walked slowly along the street, past familiar houses that no longer looked familiar, their curtains twitching as you passed, their porch lights glowing weakly but not inviting. You could feel the eyes on you, not directly, but from behind glass, from across fences, from the shadows. A woman watering her flowers turned her head sharply away when she noticed you. An old man sitting on his porch spat into the dirt and shuffled inside. Even the stray dog that sometimes followed you for scraps stood at the corner and did not come closer. The town was pulling back from you, shrinking as much as the house had, leaving you stranded in the middle of streets that used to feel like home. By the time you returned, the porch light above your door buzzed weakly, moths circling the glass in frantic, futile spirals. At first you thought the step was empty, but then your eyes caught the square shape in the shadows, wrapped neatly in brown paper and tied with a thin piece of twine. Your chest tightened. You crouched, the boards creaking under your weight, and reached for it with hesitant fingers. The paper was rough, stiff at the corners, the twine digging into the folds as though it had been tied in a hurry. Your hands shook as you pulled the knot loose. The sound of the string snapping open seemed unnaturally loud against the droning chorus of insects. Inside lay a bird. Its wings were bent at unnatural angles, feathers dull and stiff with dirt. Its glassy eyes stared at nothing, and its beak was slightly open, frozen in a final sound that had never come. The smell was faint but sharp enough to make your stomach twist. Beside the tiny body lay a scrap of paper, folded once and torn unevenly from a larger sheet. The word slashed across it in black ink was so heavy, so deliberate, that the pen had cut grooves into the paper fibers. Stop. The letters seemed to vibrate in the night air, each stroke screaming louder than the cicadas. For a long moment you could do nothing but stare. The bird's small form blurred in your vision, your heartbeat pounding so loudly it drowned out every other sound. You remembered your brother, years ago, sitting by the creek with his hands cupped around a baby sparrow that had fallen from its nest. He had nursed it with crumbs of bread, keeping it warm until it was strong enough to fly. He had laughed then, saying he would never let something so small suffer if he could stop it. Now someone had taken that memory and twisted it, laid it on your porch as if to prove how powerless you were. Your stomach lurched. You dropped the package onto the boards, bow rising in your throat. You staggered back, one hand gripping the railing until the wood groaned under the strain of your fingers. The porch light buzzed above you, indifferent, moths burning themselves against the glass in their endless dance, and you realized how cruelly fitting it was, drawn to the light, even when it destroyed them. The message was clear. It wasn't whispers now. It wasn't half-heard fragments or sidelong glances. It was direct. It was personal. And it was meant to break you. You didn't sleep that night. The house, though unchanged, had taken on the feel of a cage. Every shadow seemed longer, every corner sharper, every sound stretched into something sinister. You tried to stay in your room, but the silence there pressed too hard, so you found yourself in your brother's instead, sitting on the edge of his bed. The posters on the walls had begun to peel, corners curling toward the floor. A stack of magazines leaned crookedly on the nightstand. The air still carried a faint trace of his cologne, mixed now with the must of disuse. You reached for the baseball glove on the dresser, its leather cracked and stiff, and turned it over in your hands as though it might still be warm from his touch. The lighter sat beside you, catching the dim light with every movement. You flicked it open and shut, the metallic sound filling the room, until it felt almost like you could hear his voice again, low and steady, promising that he would never leave you behind. But the silence answered instead. The silence of Cedar Creek was no longer ignorance. It was no longer even fear. It was warning. And as you sat there, the shadows pressing close, you understood with a clarity that left you cold that your brother hadn't been the first to vanish. And if you kept pulling at the threads, you would not be the last. The days after the package appeared on your porch did not pass in any way you could measure. Morning still arrived, dragging sunlight over the fields and rooftops, but it felt like time itself had shifted sideways, slipping into a rhythm you no longer recognized. People still went about their lives. The church bell rang at noon, the trains rattled through town, the cicadas sang so loudly in the trees that their voices turned the air into one endless vibration, yet all of it felt uncanny, like you were moving inside a photograph where everything was familiar but nothing was truly alive. Cedar Creek had always been quiet, but this was different. The silence now had weight. It pressed against your chest, followed you down every street, reminded you with every glance that you were no longer part of the town's rhythm but a disruption to it. When you stepped into the diner, conversations stopped just as they had before, though this time they didn't even bother resuming. Mary avoided your table entirely, and the old men at the counter turned their shoulders so sharply away from you that it looked almost comical, as though you had grown into some dangerous shape they couldn't risk looking at. It was only Mark who broke the pattern. You found him behind the feed store in the late afternoon, sitting on an upturned crate, his back hunched, a cigarette trembling between his fingers. He didn't notice you at first, or maybe he was pretending not to, but when he finally looked up, his face was pale, and his eyes darted nervously toward the street before flicking back to you. "You shouldn't be here," he muttered, dragging on the cigarette as though smoke could fill the spaces words might leave behind. His voice was low, ragged, carrying the weight of too many nights without sleep. "I could say the same to you," you answered, steady though your chest ached with tension. "You were with him, Mark. Tell me what happened." His jaw worked. He shook his head hard, like he could shake the thought itself loose. "I told you before. I don't know anything." "You were with him," you pressed, stepping closer. "Don't lie to me. You know something." Mark's hand shook so badly he nearly dropped the cigarette. He stared at the ground, lips moving as if trying out words he couldn't say aloud. At last, after a silence so long you thought he would simply stand and walk away, he whispered. He was asking questions. The words barely made it out of his mouth, but once spoken, they wouldn't stop. He wanted to know about the mill. About shipments, about accounts. He was writing things down, keeping track. He thought he'd found proof. His shoulders hunched tighter, his voice shrinking further with every word. I told him to leave it alone. I begged him. But he wouldn't stop. Your pulse thundered. And then? Mark dragged the cigarette until it burned to the filter, his hand shaking as he dropped it, crushing it under his heel. His eyes flicked to the street, where a Johnson truck sat idling, its dark windows reflecting nothing but the sky. His voice was hoarse when he said, "And then he was gone. Just gone. I don't know who took him, but—" He hesitated, his lips pressing together until they were bloodless. "I think you already know." He didn't wait for you to answer. He walked away, shoulders hunched, head low, as though even standing near you was enough to draw the attention of things no one wanted to name. You stood in the alley long after he left, staring at the smoke curling up from the crushed cigarette. The mill. Always the mill. That night you searched your brother's room again. The last time, you had looked with hope. This time you looked with dread. The room smelled of dust and faint cologne, a trace of him that lingered in the fabric of the curtains, and the old flannel jackets slung over the chair. The posters on the wall, cars, rock bands, places he would never see, had begun to curl at the edges, the tape brittle and yellow. His baseball glove lay stiff on the dresser, the leather cracked. For a moment you just stood there, taking in the small artifacts of him, every object screaming of presence even in his absence. You pulled open the drawers one by one. Pens that no longer worked, a broken watch he had once promised to fix, movie stubs folded neatly, little sketches of machines drawn on the backs of envelopes. All the scattered remains of a life in progress. And then, under a stack of loose papers, your fingers brushed something harder. An envelope. Inside were slips of paper, creased and stained, receipts, each stamped with the name Johnson Grain and Mill. The dates stretched across months. Some had numbers circled in angry pen strokes, others had words scrawled across the margins. "Shorted again, off the books, where's the rest?" And on the back of one, written in your brother's jagged, hurried hand, 3 words cut through everything. "They're stealing everything." Your chest tightened until you couldn't breathe. The receipts slipped from your fingers, scattering across the floorboards like brittle leaves. You sank to your knees among them, staring at the proof that he hadn't been imagining things, that he had been uncovering something Cedar Creek was desperate to keep hidden. They weren't just stealing grain. They were stealing livelihoods, futures, entire families. And your brother had paid the price for naming it. When you showed the papers to your mother, she froze. Her rosary slipped from her hands, beads scattering across the table and rolling until they clinked against the edge. For a long moment she didn't move, her face pale, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. "Where did you find these?" she asked, her voice a whisper stripped bare. "In his room," you said. "He knew what they were doing. He was trying to prove it." Her eyes filled with tears, but behind them was something harder, something carved deep by years of fear. "I told him to stop," she whispered, her hands trembling as she gripped the table. "I told him not to dig." "What are you saying, Ma?" Your own voice broke. Her lips pressed tight. For a moment you thought she wouldn't answer, and then the words burst out, raw and jagged. "Your father thought he could stand up to them too. And look where that left us." The room tilted. "What do you mean?" But she pressed her hand to her mouth, shaking her head, refusing to say another word. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but her silence told you more than any confession could. You stood there with the papers in your hand, the lighter heavy in your pocket, the truth closing in like a storm. This wasn't just about your brother. It had always been about the Johnsons. That night you couldn't sit still. The papers from your brother's room were spread across the desk, every receipt and note glaring up at you like pieces of a puzzle that could never be solved, not because they didn't fit, but because someone had already decided the picture should never be completed. You lit the lighter, snapping it open and shut, watching the small flame dance in the dark, as if expecting it to whisper his voice back to you. The house groaned around you, floorboards settling, pipes ticking, your mother's prayers muffled from behind her closed door. It should have been ordinary, familiar, but nothing was ordinary anymore. The air itself carried weight, every sound sharper, every shadow longer. Finally you stepped outside, unable to bear the 4 walls pressing so tightly against your skin. The street was empty, the sky moonless. Porch lights glowed here and there, but none of them felt like beacons. They were pale, weak, halos that only deepened the darkness around them. The cicadas had quieted, leaving the night raw and hollow. You walked fast, then slower, then fast again, your own rhythm betraying your nerves. Halfway down the block you realized you weren't alone. At first, it was faint, almost easy to dismiss, the sound of footsteps just out of sync with your own. You slowed. They slowed. You stopped. Silence. The hair on the back of your neck rose. You turned, but the street stretched behind you, empty, houses dark, curtains drawn. You told yourself it was nothing, the echo of your own steps, nerves twisting sound into something else. And then you heard it again. A low growl, mechanical, far down the road but drawing closer. You looked back, and there they were, headlights sweeping the corner, cutting through the dark like knives. A truck, rolling forward slow, deliberate, the engine humming deep, the kind of sound that made your chest tighten. You quickened your pace, gravel crunching beneath your shoes. The truck matched you, crawling forward, unhurried but unrelenting. Every time you looked back, the beams caught you in their glow, washing the world in white. You turned down a side street. The truck followed. You cut across the vacant lot by the feed store, weeds snapping underfoot, the night air heavy with the smell of dry grass. When you stumbled back onto the main road, the headlights found you again, steady, waiting. Your heart hammered, your throat tight. Running would be useless, but staying still felt impossible. At last you ducked into the alley beside the drugstore, pressing yourself flat against the wall, forcing your breath quiet. The truck rolled past at the end of the street, its headlights sweeping across the brick before disappearing into the dark. You stayed there, pressed into the shadow, until the silence returned. Even then you didn't move, afraid that even your heartbeat might betray you. When you finally slipped home, your legs trembled with every step. The porch creaked as you climbed it, and for a moment you stood frozen at the door, fumbling with the key, certain you would hear the truck's growl again. But the night stayed still. Until you saw it. Something white against the dark wood of the doorframe, held in place by a single nail. Your fingers shook as you pulled it free. A scrap of paper, edges rough, words slashed across it in thick black strokes. Next is you. The letters seemed to burn in the faint porch light, each one heavier than the last, the kind of message that didn't need explanation, the kind that left no room for doubt. You stood there for a long time, the paper trembling in your hand, the silence of Cedar Creek pressing close around you. They weren't warning you anymore. They were promising. The night after the note appeared on your door stretched endlessly, heavy with the kind of silence that feels alive. You lay on your bed staring at the ceiling, the words etched in your mind, next is you. Every time your eyes shut, you saw them scrawled across the dark, the letters growing larger until they filled the room. Your mother's prayers drifted faintly from behind her closed door, but even those had lost the rhythm of faith. They were frantic now, cracked, desperate bargains with a God she no longer trusted to listen. By morning, you had already made the choice that had been building since the day your brother vanished. All the threads pulled in the same direction, every receipt, every whisper, every half-confession from Mark. They led to one place, the Johnson Mill. It was the spine of Cedar Creek, the great wooden beast that loomed over the fields, its shadow stretching across half the town. Generations had fed it, hauling in grain, shipping out profit, until the mill's name had been carved into every debt and every mortgage. Even abandoned, its bones still dominated the horizon, its windows black and hollow, its roof sagging but unbroken. It wasn't just a building. It was the monument to the Johnsons' power, and you knew in your gut that if your brother had found proof, it was buried in those walls. The walk out to the mill felt longer than you remembered, though you traveled those fields countless times. The dirt road stretched ahead like an artery, lined with weeds that rattled in the faint evening wind. The cicadas screamed louder here, their voices carrying across the open land, until even your heartbeat seemed to match their rhythm. You kept glancing behind you, half expecting to see headlights creeping over the rise, but the road stayed empty, the horizon bare. Still, you felt watched, as though the very sky was aware of your trespass. By the time you reached the fence, night had fully claimed the fields. The mill loomed against the stars, its towering frame blotting out constellations, its broken wheel a silhouette that looked more like a gallows than machinery. The air smelled of damp grain and rust, thick enough to make you swallow hard. For a long moment you stood there, your hand resting on the rough wood of the fence, heart hammering so violently it made your fingers tremble. You thought of your mother back in the house, clutching her rosary, whispering prayers she no longer believed. You thought of your brother, his voice steady and defiant, promising he would uncover the truth. And you thought of the lighter in your pocket, the one he had carried everywhere, the one that now seemed to burn even without a flame. You climbed the fence. On the other side, weeds clawed at your jeans, broken tools jutted like bones from the dirt, and the shadows of rusted machinery leaned crooked against the ground. Every step brought the building closer, its siding warped and splintered, its glass panes shattered into jagged mouths. Yet despite its decay, the place felt alive, as though the walls themselves were listening. Inside, the darkness was thick, swallowing the pale glow of your lighter when you flicked it open. The flame barely reached a few feet ahead, throwing long shadows across the hulking shapes of gears and chutes. The smell of mildew and dust was suffocating, but underneath it was something else, a faint sweetness, rotting grain, clinging and sour. Your footsteps echoed too loudly on the wooden floorboards, each creak a betrayal. The silence here wasn't empty. It was watchful, patient, the kind of silence that waits for you to make a mistake. You imagined your brother walking these same boards, the lighter's flame shaking in his hand, his heart pounding just as yours did now. The further you went, the more the place felt less like a workplace and more like a cathedral to something unholy. Rusted belts dangled like rotting vines. Broken ladders leaned against beams that stretched into darkness. The air hummed faintly with the echo of machinery that had been still for years, as if the building itself remembered its old rhythm. At the far end of the main floor you found a stairwell, its railing loose, the steps groaning beneath your weight as you climbed. The lighter threw shadows across the walls, where old posters clung in tatters, slogans urging loyalty to the mill, loyalty to the family who owned it. The words were faded, but the command in them remained sharp. At the top, a narrow walkway stretched along the wall, overlooking the cavern of machinery below. You moved slowly, the boards flexing beneath your weight, until you reached a corner where something felt different. A plank sat loose, not nailed as tightly as the rest. You crouched, pried it up, and felt your breath catch. A notebook. The cover was worn, the edges frayed, but when you flipped it open, the handwriting inside was unmistakable. Your brother's jagged script filled the pages, line after line of dates and numbers, arrows connecting shipments to shortages, notes scrawled in the margins. Short again, missing weight, not logged. And then, written across one page in dark strokes that carved into the paper. Sheriff knows. Your chest tightened so fiercely you thought it might break. Page after page was proof, not just suspicion. He had been building a case, collecting the kind of truth no one in Cedar Creek dared to name aloud. He had gotten so close. Too close. You stood there in the loft, the notebook trembling in your hands, the lighter flickering as though it too sensed the weight of what you now carried. For a moment, pride surged in you, pride that your brother had been brave enough to face the darkness everyone else fled from. But beneath it, dread grew heavier. Because bravery in Cedar Creek never ended with triumph. It ended in silence. And that was when you heard it. Voices. The voices came first as a murmur, low and indistinct, blending with the hum of cicadas outside and the creak of the old timbers, so soft you almost convinced yourself it was nothing. But then a board snapped somewhere below, the sound sharp, certain, carrying up through the cavernous dark of the mill. You froze, the notebook clutched in your hands, the lighter's flame flickering in the draft. There were two of them, maybe three. Boots against the grain, steady, unhurried, the rhythm of men who knew the ground belonged to them. Their voices rose clearer as they moved deeper into the mill, words catching in the still air, hard consonants striking like blows. Told him to keep quiet. Kid didn't listen. Just like his old man. A pause, then a laugh, harsh, without humor. Doesn't matter now. Ain't nobody asking questions after what happened. You pressed yourself low against the walkway, breath shallow, every muscle aching with the effort not to move. The lighter hissed as you snapped it shut, the flame dying, plunging you into darkness so complete it felt like drowning. Below, the footsteps shifted, closer now, the beams of flashlights slicing through the machinery, sweeping across gears and broken belts. Their glow caught on rust and shattered glass, each reflection a blade in the dark. You clutched the notebook to your chest, its edges digging into your skin, as though holding it tighter might erase the sound of your heartbeat. "Boss says the sheriff's nervous," one voice muttered. "Too many questions. Too many eyes. He'll stay in line," the other replied. "He always does. Sheriff owes more than anyone." Their laughter echoed, bouncing off the high beams, a sound that hollowed your stomach. You knew then, with sickening clarity, that the pages in your hands were heavier than any weapon, and twice as dangerous. The voices moved closer, boots striking the staircase now, groaning under their weight. You shifted back along the walkway, each step a prayer that the boards wouldn't give you away. The shadows thickened, swallowing you whole, but the light from their flashlights began to creep upward, stretching long fingers along the railing. You ducked into the corner, pressing yourself against the wall, the smell of mildew choking your throat. A rat skittered across the boards, its claws scratching loud as thunder in the silence, and one of the men barked a curse, swinging the light toward the sound. For one suspended heartbeat, the beam swept so close across your face you felt its heat, and you bit your tongue to stop the gasp that clawed its way up your throat. They didn't see you. Not yet. "Check the loft," one of them ordered, and the boards shuddered as the first man began to climb. Panic surged hot in your chest. You crawled along the walkway on hands and knees, every movement excruciatingly slow, the notebook pressed tight under your arm. Behind you, the footsteps grew louder, the groan of the stairwell telling you exactly how close they were. The ladder at the far end of the loft loomed ahead. You scrambled down, gripping the rungs until splinters bit your palms, your breath ragged in your ears. The lighter slipped from your pocket, and clattered against the boards below, the sound sharp and unnatural in the cavernous silence. "Wait!" a voice barked from above. Light exploded across the loft as the men reached the top, beams slicing wildly, catching the glint of the fallen lighter. "He's here!" The shout cracked through the mill like a gunshot. You ran. Your feet pounded across the floorboards, dust rising in choking clouds with every step. The machinery loomed on all sides, jagged silhouettes clawing at the dark, and behind you came the thunder of boots, shouts echoing, the chase closing in. You ducked between rusted chutes, vaulted over broken crates, the notebook clutched so tightly your fingers went numb. "Stop him!" Their voices carried, furious, certain, filling the emptiness of the mill. A hand grabbed at your shirt as you passed, catching the fabric, but you twisted hard, tearing free, stumbling into the open. The doorway was ahead, a rectangle of faint night beyond, and you hurled yourself toward it, lungs burning, legs screaming. Boards splintered under your weight, dust stinging your eyes, but you didn't stop, not even when the beam of a flashlight swept across your back, blinding, searing. You burst through the door into the fields, the cool air of night slamming against your face, sweet and sharp after the rot of the mill. The grass whipped your legs as you tore through it, the sound of boots behind you growing fainter with every desperate stride. Only when you reached the fence, scrambling over it, landing hard on the other side, did you dare to stop. You dropped to the ground, chest heaving, the notebook clutched against you like a lifeline. The mill loomed behind you, black and watchful, its broken wheel silhouetted against the stars. Voices still echoed faintly from within, furious and frustrated, but they did not follow. Not yet. You pressed your forehead to the dirt, the paper trembling in your grip. The lighter was gone, lost in the chase, but the notebook remained. Proof. And proof was enough to damn you. The night after the chase clung to you like a second skin, heavy and sour, a memory you could not scrub away no matter how many times you washed your face or changed your clothes. You lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling as your mother's whispers drifted down the hallway. They weren't the calm prayers of habit anymore. They were frantic and broken, fragments of bargains spoken into the dark, as if she were begging not for salvation but for delay, one more night before the inevitable knock at the door. On the desk by your bed, the notebook waited. Its cover was scuffed, the edges torn, but it seemed to glow faintly in the shadows, as though it carried its own quiet fire. You had dropped it there after stumbling home, too shaken to keep it near, yet too terrified to let it out of sight. It had been your brother's, and now it was yours, his last words, his last fight, bound in paper and ink. When the first pale light of morning cut across the floorboards, you reached for it, your fingers trembling as though you were lifting something far heavier than a book. Inside, the handwriting rushed across the pages, jagged and uneven. Shipments logged against deliveries that never arrived. Payments circled in red ink, numbers that made no sense, margins filled with angry scrawls. Some entries were so hurried that the pen had ripped through the paper, leaving holes where the truth had burned too hot. And then there were the names. Farmers, laborers, shopkeepers, men who had dared complain. Beside some, a simple note, gone. Beside others, family moved away. Each one a story swallowed whole. On one page your brother had drawn a crude map of Cedar Creek, lines running from the mill to the sheriff's office, arrows curling back to the courthouse, circles dark around dates of town meetings. And in the corner, written so hard the paper had nearly torn, "Sheriff knows." Your breath caught. These weren't guesses. These weren't suspicions. This was evidence, line by line, written by a man who knew the walls were closing in. Pride flared for a moment, pride that he had been brave enough to write it down, to face the truth head on. But the pride twisted into grief almost immediately, because bravery was what had taken him from you. You carried the notebook to the kitchen. The boards creaked under your bare feet, the house itself seeming to listen. Your mother was already there, hunched at the table, her rosary tangled in her hands. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, her lips moving silently even as her fingers twisted the beads. When she saw the notebook, she recoiled as though you had placed a loaded gun between you. "I told him to stop," she whispered, her voice raw, frayed to the edge. "I told him it would end the same way it ended before." The words struck something cold inside you. "The same way what ended?" She shook her head, but tears filled her eyes, spilling down her cheeks. "Your father," she said at last, and the name cracked like glass between you. "He thought he could fight them too. He thought proof would save him. He believed if he shouted loud enough, someone would care. And all it gave him was a coffin I couldn't pay for, and debts I'm still chained to." The room tilted. Your father's death, you had believed it was natural, a weak heart, a cruel trick of fate. Now you saw it for what it was, another silence the town had agreed to keep. Your mother clutched her rosary until her knuckles blanched. "If you love me," she whispered, her voice breaking, "burn that book. Burn it before it buries you too." She turned away then, stumbling down the hall, her shadow stretching long against the wall until she disappeared into her room. The door shut with a hollow click, sealing you out. You sat at the table alone, the notebook open in front of you, the words glaring up as though demanding to be heard. You traced the lines with your finger, your brother's voice echoing in every mark of ink. By evening you stepped outside, the notebook pressed tight under your arm. The streets looked the same as they always had, children's bikes leaning against porches, dogs barking from behind fences, the scent of cut grass on the air. But the people had changed. Conversations cut short the moment you drew close. Windows shut with quick, deliberate snaps. Faces turned away, some with pity, most with fear. And by the time the sun fell and the shadows lengthened, you knew with perfect clarity. The Johnsons already knew too. The truck's growl followed you down Main Street like an animal circling its prey, patient and steady, as if it had no need to rush. The buildings leaned close on either side, their dark windows full of shifting shadows. Curtains twitched, faces appeared for a heartbeat, then vanished again. Even without a word, you knew the whole town was watching. The truck slowed, then stopped. For a moment, silence stretched so thick you could hear your own heartbeat in your ears. Then the headlights snapped on, sudden and blinding, pouring down the street in a flood of white. The light painted your shadow across the pavement, thin and small, while the notebook pressed hard against your chest. The driver's door opened. A man climbed out, broad, deliberate, his hat pulled low. You didn't need to see his face to know he was one of them. Johnson men didn't need names. Their presence was enough. "You've been busy," he said, his voice low, almost casual, though it carried the weight of a verdict. His gaze dropped to the notebook. "That doesn't belong to you. It belonged to my brother," you said, your words catching, your voice sharper than you meant. A faint smile curved his lips, humorless, hard. "And look where it got him." He stepped closer, his boots striking the pavement in slow, steady rhythm. "That book doesn't matter. You think anyone will read it? You think anyone cares? This town doesn't want the truth. It never has." The words cut like glass, not because they were lies, but because deep inside, you feared they were true. Cedar Creek had survived on silence for generations. What was one more name added to the long list of those who had spoken and vanished? But you knew you couldn't hand it over. "I'm not afraid of you," you said, though your voice cracked at the end. The man's smile widened, humorless, his hand extending as though he were offering you mercy. "Then you're a fool. Last chance." Before you could answer, the street itself seemed to shift. Doors opened. Mary stepped out of the diner, apron still tied around her waist. Daniels leaned in the doorway of his store. Even Mrs. Carter shuffled out, clutching her letters like a shield. More faces pressed against windows, pale in the glow of the headlights. They didn't speak. They didn't move closer. They only watched. The Johnson man raised his voice just enough for all to hear. "Tell him. Tell him what happens when you don't keep quiet." But the crowd said nothing. Only silence answered, heavier than stone. The man turned back to you, his smile fading into something colder. "It's over. Give it to me." Your grip on the notebook tightened until your knuckles ached. You looked at the faces around you, eyes filled with pity, with fear, with resignation. You thought of your mother, her broken voice begging you to burn it. And then you thought of your brother, his voice echoing across the years, "One day, we'll get out. You'll see." And you ran. The truck roared alive behind you, its engine howling. Headlights swung wildly across the street, chasing your shadow as your feet slammed against the pavement. Shouts rose behind you, sharp and furious, but you didn't look back. You cut down alleys, hurdled fences, tore through backyards where dogs barked and lights snapped on. No one stepped in your way. No one called out. They only watched. Your lungs burned, your legs trembled, but you kept going. The notebook thudded against your ribs with every step, the paper edges biting into your skin. It felt less like you were carrying it and more like it was carrying you, dragging you forward no matter how much you wanted to stop. The bridge rose out of the dark, its boards silver in the moonlight. You stumbled onto it, your knees slamming hard against the wood, the sound echoing down into the black water below. The river whispered beneath you, endless and cold. You pulled yourself upright, clutching the notebook to your chest. You opened it blindly, your eyes falling on the page where your brother had written "Sheriff knows." The words blurred as your vision swam, but they burned into you all the same. Behind you, the roar of the truck grew louder, headlights cutting across the trees, voices shouting your name. The chase hadn't ended. It never would. You realized then, in a moment as sharp as lightning, that Cedar Creek's greatest secret had never been about what the Johnsons had stolen. It was about what everyone else had surrendered. Their silence. And now it would claim you too.